Nubiart, a different perspective on the African world.
Welcome, Dr. Spence-Lewis.
Thank you for inviting me.
Could you just tell us a bit about who the Herero are?
The Herero are a population in southwest Africa who migrated to the region during the 1600s. They're largely agricultural people and cattle-raising people. They place a great emphasis on cattle, both sacred and profane, historically.
How did the Germans come to be in Namibia, which was then called Southwest Africa?
It's important for the interview that be placed within context. And there are 3 points that I would like to put forward with respect to what you asked me. Number 1 is the fact that the missionary societies were very influential in the Germans coming to what is now Namibia. Number 2, the application of German imperial law. And 3, the relationships between the Dutch, the English, and other European peoples. And this came about because of the imperial relationships or the royal relationships between the House of Hanover and the present royal house. The last Hanover was Queen Victoria. And as you know, that particular reign was very active in the genocide of African peoples.
So the Germans coming into Namibia, that was how it all came about? Yeah?
Yes, it is within a context of the rivalry of European peoples. The Germans did not simply act on their own. As a community, the Deutsch peoples came in because of their relationships with other European peoples. And as they established social patterns in what is now Namibia or Southwest Africa, these points that I've spelled out were emphasized.
So why was the decision taken to marginalize or exterminate the Herero?
For various reasons. The Germans wanted natural resources. They wanted land for the peoples that had migrated from Germany. Initially, this was not the case because the missionary societies were there. And they got on, because of their faith, very well with the Nama and the other peoples. But as rivalries began to develop, as the Boers came into the country, as other European peoples came into the country, as the English peoples came into the country, there began to be an interplay between these various European groups. And the result was the genocide of these indigenous African peoples.
And this happened in 1904. What were the historical implications of the German policy?
The historical implications within the context of the points that I mentioned are the application of German imperial law. That law was applied to the Nama and the Herero people. There was no respect for the cultural traditions of the indigenous Africans. For example, one of the aspects or the features of German imperial law that if you were tried for any severe penalty, such as treason or murder, you were decapitated. So one of the things that the Van Trotha, who was the leader that was sent shortly before 1904 from Deutschland to come to Southwest Africa, was to get the head of Chief Samuel, the paramount chief. So decapitation was a part of German imperial law. So that's just an example of the social aspects of Deutschland or Europe being applied contrary to the cultural dignity of the people.
The term genocide is used. I mean, what were the actual specific on-the-ground effects of the German policy?
I shall give 3 points. Number 1, the people lost their cattle. Initially, Germans simply stole the cattle, or they gave false criteria for getting the cattle and the land. Second, their cultural dignity, which they lost their ability to present to their children and to their lineage for the future the integrity of their community. And number 3, they lost their land. First, the culture, because if you lose your culture, then this is the basis for your land, your dignity. First, the culture, the loss of the cattle, the loss of the resources, the control of the land.
Okay, I saw a program recently where it actually showed one time when the Herero, I think they called them for a peace meeting, and then just when the Herero were coming out, who they never massacred, they just drove into the desert and then just hunted them down.
Well, this was only one feature of destroying or genocidal practice. They starved the Herero peoples. They deprived them of their means of livelihood. They were agricultural people. They were not salespeople. They were not people who were builders. So therefore, if you deprive a person of their livelihood, that is what certain standards or criteria of this country, of Great Britain, is about. You deprive a man of his livelihood. And this is what the Germans did.
Was this something that was explicitly decided from Berlin, the capital of Germany, or was this just that the people in Berlin turned a blind eye and let the people on the ground get on with what they were doing?
Initially, there was minimal contact for the simple reason that there were no rivalries. So there was not really the opportunity to exchange. As the Deutsch community became more settled, there became a need to develop contacts with the imperial government in Berlin. And this is what happened. The first commissioner was sent in about 1895 from Germany. And the commissioner now began to bring formally German laws and German regulations. When Van Trotha in 1904 sent his order, he closed the order by referring to the imperial government. These are some of the aspects of the contact with Berlin. May I read this extermination order from Van Trotha, the German Deutsch general? Van Trotha, who had taken charge, sent messengers of peace promising the combatants safe return with their cattle to their lands. Then, as the people were coming in, he issued the extermination order, and I quote, "I, the great general of the German soldiers, send this letter to the Herero nation. The Hereros are no longer German subjects. They have murdered and robbed. They have cut off the ears and the noses and privy parts of wounded soldiers, and they are now too cowardly to fight. The Herero nation must now leave the country. If the people do it not, I will compel them with the big tube." Big tube refers to the gun. "Within the German frontier, every Herero, with or without a rifle, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will not take over any more women and children, but I will either drive them back to your people or have them fired on. These are my words to the nation of the Hereros, the great general of the mighty emperor Van Trotha." So he was referring, when he said mighty emperor, he was referring to Deutschland.
Why were the Hereros singled out for that treatment and not the other groups of people in that area?
Perhaps the reason the Hereros were singled out is because of their cultural determination and because they fought the hardest. But they were overwhelmed by the fact of military power from the militarists.
So in this extermination, how many people is it reckoned died?
80,000 or more.
How did it end? How did the actual stoppage of the genocide come about, or did it ever stop?
It's never stopped, but there are different points to it. It ended in terms of a demarcation of the social circumstances with World War I. World War I, Germany lost the colonies. Tanganyika, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, or Namibia. So therefore, Deutschland was obliged to terminate its war to some extent on the Herero people and other peoples of that region. However, there were other implications in that Southern Africa, or the South African government, now joined with the Deutsch people and Germany and other European peoples, including the United States, to further the extermination of the peoples. So this goes back to your question whether it has ever ended. It has not with respect to that.
This genocide is considered the first genocide of the 20th century. Do you think other countries looked at what had happened and said, okay, maybe we can get away with this as well in our country?
Yes, perhaps one reason for the extermination of the Jews in Germany during Second World War is perhaps because of the way and manner the indigenous people of Africa were exterminated and the policies that grew out of that and the cooperation from other European countries. We must remember or look at historically that with the Jews there were two conferences, the Evian Conference and the Bermuda Conference, and that was from 1938 to about 1942, wherein the international community came together to say, allegedly, that they were going to stop or prevent the extermination of the Jews in Deutschland. This never came about. So this gave the Führer, Adolf Hitler, the red light, so to speak, to continue with his policy. So it is in Namibia, because following the war, even though Deutschland lost the colonies, allegedly, they were never told to leave the country as they were in Tanganyika or in the Cameroons. They were allowed to keep their land and all the privileges that they had. So this reinforced the attitude that they had in the treatment of these particular peoples in Africa.
Is there any direct link between the people involved in exterminating the Herero and the genocide of the Jews in terms of, is there a link going back through the German state?
Yes, but I think we have to look at the imperial link between the House of Hanover, Queen Victoria, and the royal link in the United Kingdom. That existed. They cooperated because during Queen Victoria's reign, that South African apartheid began to plant its deepest roots. So it is not possible that South Africa was going to work in the interest of African peoples. It doesn't work that way politically.
So why did you become interested in the case?
I became interested for medical reasons because in the loss of their culture or in the deprivation of the application and the development of their culture, they were deprived of the ability of self-reliance. They weren't able to develop a medical program, education. They received funding disproportionate. They only received about 3% of the funding. They were isolated on reserves. The reserves got no funding. They were only allowed as a labor reserve, as slaves. Even in certain parts of Africa now, this is the case in terms of the reserves. So it's for this reason that I became involved. And also because of research in eugenics, which started in the United Kingdom initially.
Namibia, Namibia, yeah, Namibia, 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 yeah, Namibia. O marumendu motate, o maharero, o fetbwe, o mandume, o ipubuye, o nehale. Shamwaha, o haimeko, betu serauliye, Namibia, 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 yeah, Namibia, Namibia, yeah, Namibia, oh, Namibia, Namibia. Namibia makugo orongo wetu owingo wingi shua bangamo utiremo shakati ko shakati makugo korushanja rotundo runene.
That was part one of the interview with Dr I M Spence-Lewis. Underneath me the track called Otate Vetu by Jackson M. Kojua, and it's actually by Onyeka, the Torch, from the album Namibia Will Be Free. And this tune is actually for the pioneers of Namibian resistance to German colonialism, and it's a Herero tune. So this is what the people sing about when, you know, they want to inspire themselves to get back their land and their life and their liberty and their cattle.
Komitamire komasubiro kwa kandi batumba ompanda ulizo bitenda kepako oko unembere ya kairo korupindi njatira koshinono alire chipaiko kokaiti makugo kwa binebya mukango mbeyongombe yakapeko omura haturura ulyo kafupa turura kokure kolondundu zetu komaheke wetu kokakoberwa konjio mukandi wakashioru ngwatiro londura hariwa kome bangeri ongayo yapuko birongo tate mocho mwise haulondanga ya mukako mawa komuhuko bura komundo kaverondu ngwalirire inakazojanja kongoro no mundu magu ya muni kwa ikashua bandu pehimulombero ashabano mundu mbamuno ngutirwa onjo yoruri moshinyo makushia kurama shanje ateka nushia kaonje ya sora tate maharero mandumeye aopepo nehane vetusera uriena tate vetusera Namibia oretoveni Namibia Namibia
So just now the Herero are pursuing a case in the American courts for reparations against Germany. Do you know what stage that's at?
I can't say, and I wouldn't like to comment on that, because I would have thought that it would be sub judice. But it's important that one look at the history of the circumstances. And one would hope that whoever may preside, the judge that may preside at this case, that the entire history, both in terms of the indigenous history of the people, the history of Deutschland, the Imperial German law, the application of that, 7 African or indigenous people had to give witness against one German. The same was in the United States in the early history of slavery. If a Deutsch person did something against an African person, 7 black people had to testify against them in the court. And even then, on appeal, if they got 5 years, it was usually cut back to 3 months. So, to go back to your question or statement, the courts would need to look at the German imperial law. They would need to look at the relationship between the House of Hanover and their relationships that supported or reinforced missionary work and other types of social patterns within the colonies.
This is Herero pursuing a case. I mean, has Germany indicated any willingness to redress the historical injustices outside of the court action?
To be fair to Germany, they have said that they have done enough. This is their general attitude because of the programs that they have put in place in Namibia or Southwest Africa. I have not been to Namibia, so I cannot give a observer's comment on that. I think for one to really be fair, one needs to speak to the German minister that the case would come under, which would probably be the Minister of Justice. And one would have to visit Namibia and speak to Herero peoples there. Because if we're talking about justice, justice demands that you consider as many aspects of the situation as possible. I would have hoped that the courts go to Namibia and visit the United States courts.
Did you know what role the governments of Germany and Namibia are playing in the court dispute?
I couldn't say that. I can't comment on that because my facility of German is not of a standard to read the court reports. And I would want to be briefed by a legal advisor, both from basic law of Germany and from the United States.
There's something you touched on earlier that the Germans maybe think they've done enough. Right? Is that like they've compensated the Namibian state for general things they've done in Namibia, but maybe the Herero have still felt marginalized in that settlement.
I would concur with that. They have done much for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. The Jewish state is separate from the Jewish people because there's a Jewish diaspora. One of the things the Germans have done is put up a memorial in Berlin. They put that up within the last 18 months or so. They've been working on that for years. A memorial to the Holocaust victims or the Shoah. So there are different aspects that could be done both independently and in cooperation with the Deutsche government. And obviously, from the compensation that is being sought, this doesn't seem to be satisfactory to the Herero people.
You said the Germans are still in the country. They weren't expelled. It's over 100 years. I mean, I would imagine that the Germans are still involved in running the commanding heights of the economy in the country.
Yes, because of the education. In order to have that type of competitive rivalry, one needs to be educated within that system. You need to go to Harvard or Yale if you want to go into certain aspects of high business finance. If you're just going to have a market stall, it will not get you, highly unlikely, into Wall Street. It may prepare you for Wall Street, but it won't get you into Wall Street. You have to be with the boys. One wonders whether this has been the case with the Herero people or with the Namibian government. Further, we have to go back to the period following World War I. People like the Prime Minister, Lord George, and General Smuts, they did not take any restrictions to remove the German people. In fact, they gave them citizenship. So even though they were slapped on the hand through the Versailles Diktat, as the Deutsch people say, they were not removed from the country. Under the Nationality Act, I believe of 1924, from the Cape government, they were given the opportunity, if they desired to take it up, to be citizens of the country. Further, under the mandate of the League of Nations, that territory was taken over on the requests of the Committee for the League of Nations. And these people were considered, I wouldn't say barbarians, to use the term might be a bit strong for an international term, but they were considered not of the standard of white civilization.
Subhuman, I think, is the term they use in
Well,
that aspect.
Well, subhuman was used more in military terms by the Deutsche government and by all European countries. I think it's very important to point out here that the terms and the references that the Deutsche government used are ones that have been used by all European peoples, whether they be Dutch, whether they be English, whether they be Belgium, whether they be from the United States. All European peoples use these terms.
Subhuman, heathen, pagan.
Yes, all of this. Okay. And this is why they came to civilize Africa, the Rhenish Missionary Society, to bring Christianity to the heathen. But nevertheless, the Herero always knew one God. They always knew one God.
So what lessons do you think are there for marginalized people who are facing genocide today? Because the whole history of the last 100, 150 years has been, every 5 years there's been some major genocide, right, where a whole set of people are just close to being extinct, and it's continuing to this day where the legacies of those genocides is still that now you find that it's not just going on in one place, it's going on in lots of places.
I would have thought that the first aspect is for so-called marginalized peoples to realize that it is a international situation, that they are not the only one. It is happening in the Amazon, it is happening in the Congo, it is happening in the United States with certain groups of indigenous peoples or Native Americans. It's an international situation. It is necessary to forge links internationally and to make representations. And it is also important to learn the languages of Europe. It's important to learn German so that one can study German imperial law. There are so many documents, both within Germany and outside of Germany, that have been written about the Herero situation. And it is only by knowing the language that one can delve deeply and make the proper representations. with respect to the circumstances.
One thing about the Germans always seem to love documenting all what they're doing, all their genocides, all their plans, all their experiments and everything like that. And a lot of other cultures don't document, and it seems that maybe up to this point Germans always get vilified for being the most nasty people of last century, of the 20th century, when other people have probably done things equally as horrific, but they just never wrote it on paper.
One has to put these situations in context. The Deutsch people were the last people, so to speak, to come into the modern scramble of Africa. That was with the Berlin Agreement in about 1885. There were other peoples as well, but they were the last group of European peoples. This was encouraged because of missionary societies, the Rhenish Society. So again, we go back to the importance of missionary societies and faith groups in Europe that contributed to genocide. And it was necessary for the Deutsch people to look to European countries for advice. They had to look to the English, to the Belgians, and to the Portuguese and to the Spanish, because these are people that had a longer history. Not because they necessarily shared common beliefs, but because they had experience. And for rivalries, this is the way that they worked.
So that meant what? They were documenting everything to prove like, oh, we're up on your level.
Correct. This is why the Deutsch people went and studied eugenics in California, to show that we were as informed as you in California. And we could sterilize as many people as you with the greatest of expertise. So the Deutsch people, from my observation of the situation, didn't document things because they necessarily wanted to, but they wanted to show how informed they were about particular circumstances.
Because that's coming back to haunt them.
It's coming back to haunt many European peoples. If you go to certain records in this country, they will share the relationships with the imperial families of Hanover and the modern royal family. If you examine the records in Belgium under King Leopold, you will find the same circumstances. If you examine the Dutch records, you will find the same circumstances. But the fault herein lies is because many African historians are too isolated. They think, oh, this has only happened to us in the Cameroons, or this has only happened to African Americans, or it has only happened to the British, but it is a universal phenomenon. And this is the context from wherein I work. I don't work with respect to it's only happening in Britain alone or to African Americans alone. I see it as an international phenomena. And until we do that and deal with it collectively, we are at a loss.
So where can people get more information about the Herero case?
What I am doing at present, I am preparing a very short paper to put online for people to get information. www.marcusgarveylibrary, all one word, lowercase, .org.uk. www.marcusgarveylibrary.org.uk, or simply go to Welcome to Marcus Garvey Library. And I will have a very brief document with pictures of the Herero and so on in 2 weeks' time, 14 days' time.
The quote that you read from Von Trotta, what book did that come out of?
That came from a book that I was researching having to do with the Herero people.
Have you got anything to add?
I do hope that the Deutsch people, or the Deutsch leadership, which is now unified from Eastern Germany and Western Germany, I hope it doesn't have to go to court. I hope that compensation is given to the people in a dignified way and manner so that they don't have to continue to suffer. And that the Deutsch people realize that their history has moved on, and this is one reason why they should do it. And if they go to court, they really haven't moved on. Their basic law is only reflected for their people and not for the people who they are interacting with.
Okay, Dr. I M Spence-Lewis, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Nubiart, a different perspective on the African world.